In this video, I'm going to tell you about how you are probably painting too much of your miniature. So miniatures of today that we see from the big companies all the way down into the small companies have generally much more detail than miniatures of old. It used to be that you sculpted miniatures and you either sculpted them at 1-to-1 size with little tiny tools and putty and things like that. And sometimes extra details were hard to come by in those types of sculpts. Also, just more detail means more time to sculpt and it just takes longer and all that kind of stuff. There are also types of miniatures out there that are done in like what's known as 3-ups, which are just basically 3 times larger, and you sculpt them that way and then use a device to kind of trace all over them, and that's how it does a smaller version, and it's a whole thing. But nowadays, it's done predominantly with computers. The sculpting is done on a computer, so if you need to add a lot of extra details, like you have a skull, sure, you can sculpt one skull, but what if you need 20 skulls? You know, that happens. And then, you know, it's relatively simple to control, C and control V or whatever, and just copy and put skulls all over your model, and that's fine. And we live in an amazing time of skulls and detail, basically. But there's a downside. When a model can have, in this day and age, so much detail, sometimes the sculptor will use that for amazing textures, things like scales and fur and other kinds of features and other things that are fun to paint, you know what I mean? Like if you ever had to paint a lizard creature or something like that, it's pretty quick to put on, and then you throw on some wash and stuff like that, go back and do some highlighting, and even with a dry brush, and you can make it look really cool really quickly, and that's very cool. That kind of detail is the kind of detail that we like. But other times, these sculptors, and there's nothing wrong with this, don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying, other times they can go a little crazy, and so you're going to have pouches, and then sidearms, and daggers, and grenades, and then, other pouches, and then possibly more pouches, and a backpack on the backpack, and all these things can be a little daunting to paint, because if you want to sit down and actually go through and say, well, each of these is its own little thing, and it has a little story. Oh, he got this pouch on his 23rd birthday from a crazy lady who lived next door to him, in the village or whatever. I mean, you can go and do that, certainly, but it's just going to take things a lot longer to get done. And like I said, kind of daunting. The main thing that newer painters and even, painters who've been in the hobby for a while need to understand is that you don't have to paint every little bit of added detail as a different color, on your model, especially if you're painting for tabletop. If you're painting for display, and I'm rarely ever talking about painting for display on this channel because I don't do it myself. I don't have that particular skill set, and so I'm not going to try to teach you how to do it. I'm talking about how to get stuff on the table for gaming, and very frequently, when you look at a model that is just covered in lots of detail, and again, I'm not talking texture like scales or fur or anything. I'm talking about every last little thing that you can see. He's got 28 daggers and a hammer, and he's got his tent on his back, and he's like a military person who's covered. Like all of that stuff, you don't really have to paint every last. You need to want to get paint on it. You're going to want to get paint on it. But for tabletop paint, or even just painting that you're trying to make look a little bit more realistic, making some too many of the details on the model the same color, or potentially nearly the same color, and I'll get back to that, is the right way to go for most folks. If you've ever seen the non-rich people on the TV show Game of Thrones, and I don't mean like the Lannisters and the such and suches who live in keeps and castles and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about the average Joes that are out in the fields doing field stuff, out in the woods, maybe brigands, maybe farmers, whatever, all that kind of stuff. Their overall look generally has a very simple color palette, mostly browns. There's a lot of browns on everybody out there, and because some of it is leather, sometimes they're wearing a lot of leather, and leather, when you tan it, generally is brown. But sometimes it's simple cloth, and you don't have a lot of dyes. So you cloth, and the cloth is cloth colored. And then also much of it is dirt. A lot of it is dirt, I think, at least on shows like that and other kinds of, fantasy shows that try to be a little bit more realistic. I don't even know what realistic fantasy means, but you see where much of what they're wearing, though, however, is all made from the same kind of simple materials. Again, leathers that haven't been messed around color-wise. Again, cloth, stuff like that. So if your adventurers are the royal fancy pants types, and all that kind of stuff, great, you can do that. You can definitely go and make sure that they're brightly colored and there's a lot of different colors going on, all that kind of stuff. But if they're not the royal fancy pants type, if they're actually soldiers, and this, we're generally talking about painting models for wargaming after all, then you can kind of keep them a little bit more monotone. So let's say you're not into fantasy style games, you're into more maybe historical games like relatively recent military, or even modern military or things like that, or something that heads in that direction. Real life soldiers have a tendency to keep most of the things that they have on them generally the same color. If you've ever seen photos of actual soldiers out in the field these days, a lot of stuff is the same color. Maybe it's all sand, maybe it's all kind of a green or something like that. You don't go, okay, well, my grenades are this color and this is this color and this is, everything's kind of one color, because it kind of comes down to sort of a camouflage thing a little bit, and that's important. And so when you're painting these things, you look at the model and go, okay, well, so what kind of model is this? Is this kind of a slightly more realistic, even maybe we're talking about fantasy, like space sci-fi stuff, but we're still like, yeah, but it's more of a realistic thing. You can kind of keep these things to be a little bit more subtle of a paint job and paint a lot of things the same color. Now, Space Marines, on the other hand, of course, which are very popular, in 40K, Space Marines do have a fair bit of heraldry going on. There's a lot of symbology and a lot of different colors. Each different chapter's got different colors and all this kind of stuff and all that jazz. But it doesn't mean you have to paint all of it the way that you see it again in the books. When I paint Space Marines, which I haven't done in a little while, but I've done some for Kill Team, the regular troops very frequently have that eagle, kind of thing on their chest, or maybe it's a skull with wings, or it depends on the different kinds of models. If you're not a sergeant of some sort, I'm going to paint that all the same color as your armor. I don't need to go through and paint every single, chest eagle on every single Marine. The basic Marines, maybe they don't get that. But when they get to sergeant, and more importantly, at least in my opinion, when they finally get their hands off of that bolt rifle and spread out their arms a little bit to have a pistol and a sword, then it's much easier to paint that eagle, and I'll go in there and do it separately, and that's fine. But if your sci-fi soldiers aren't into crazy heraldry and all that kind of stuff too much, then keeping the color palette simple can also be a good idea and save you time. When I painted my Death Corps of Krieg for Kill Team last year, I saw a lot of people who were painting them and picking out every last little detail, making everything different, and lots of different colors and kind of things like that. And I'm not talking about rainbow colors. I'm just talking about everything's got a different color going on. And I looked at them as a little bit more like what we expect of modern military today. And I decided to kind of keep them a little bit monotone. Their leg wraps are tan, but the rest of them is kind of that green. Their helmet's a bit of a different color. Their gun, keeping it a little bit simple in those situations can, in my opinion, make those models look a little bit more realistic and a little bit less kind of crazy in the color, but it also can save you a ton of time. Now here's the quick tip, an easy way to differentiate between things like belts and pouches and holsters and scabbards and etc. from each other is to paint them all the same color. Like let's say you're painting your guy and he's using brown armor or something like that. So you paint the same color as the armor, or maybe they've got a cloak or whatever the deal is. But then once that's all dry, then you start adding different colored washes and glazes, contrast paints, stuff like that to those things. So now you've got a brown pouch on a guy's brown pants, but when you put those contrast colors over it, like a nice dark color, maybe like a siliconum gray or something like that, you can now make that pouch very quickly and simply look different than the pants that it was painted basically at the same time as, because those transparent paints are quicker and easier to control on smaller little details like that, and different transparent colors over other opaque colors can give you quick and easy, subtle, or maybe not so subtle color variations. And I'll be perfectly honest, if those things, all that, differentiating slightly with washes and glazes goes faster than you would have thought on the details, like, again, I'm kind of focusing a lot on all the extra little pouches and things, but it could be on all kinds of different stuff. If those things go faster than you thought, where you're starting to put glazes and contrast paints and speed paints and all that kind of stuff over those colors, and then you want to go back and maybe add some simple edge highlights, or if you're maybe just in the painting zone, you're just like, it's not so much that it took me less time than I thought, but I just want to keep painting a little bit more. Sometimes you get into that mood. The very easy thing you can do is go back and add some simple edge highlights with the original color. So if you painted the model brown in that area, and then threw a wash on top of it, or a glaze, or a contrast, or whatever, once that dried, you can take that original brown and go back and edge highlight kind of the upper parts of the pouch or something like that. Or you could even go back and lighten it up a little bit more with, if you want to go with a little bit more of a value contrast pop, you could go back in, add in a little bit more to that. It's totally up to you. I've done plenty of things before where I'm working on pouches and I want the flap on the pouch to be slightly differentiated from the actual pouch. So I will go back and put wash on the lower part of the pouch, but not on the flap. And then that way they look like they're two different colors. It was just very simple, just bloop. And that kind of thing can really help make the model look more interesting without you having to go back and paint every last different thing on the model. But remember, just because many models these days have an abundance of detail, some might say an overabundance of detail, doesn't mean that you have to spend time painting every single last thing separately or with a different color scheme. I mean, if you're into that and you enjoy it, then certainly keep doing it. It makes a lot of sense. There are times when I will kind of, like I mentioned before, get into the zone and I will just start doing more on a tabletop model than generally I would. It's more often than not HQ units. It's not something I generally do to troops, to standard units, but you do you. I'm just trying to show you that they're your models and then you can paint them exactly how you want. And there are many real world examples out there of characters who rock very subtle, maybe even some would say monotone color schemes. And your figures, they can do that as well. And frankly, that means that more models are going to get onto the table faster. 1, 2, 3, folks.